Welcome to Emovura Audiobooks, your home for immersive, narrated stories that pull you in and don't let go. Before we begin, if you enjoy the story, take a moment to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin tonight's story. Nobody carries you. The phone rang at 2:20 in the afternoon, and Diane Renwick would later be able to describe the exact pitch of it, a flat electronic bleat that she has never since been able to hear without her stomach dropping. She was standing at the sink in the Sandy Bay house with her hands in dishwater when she picked it up, a tea towel over one shoulder, and the woman on the other end introduced herself as Yvonne from Stormbird Crossing and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound calm, "Diane, I need you to sit down." Diane did not sit down. She stood very still with water running off her wrists onto the floor, watching it pool and then find the grout line and follow it, and said, "What's happened to my son?" "We've had an incident on the Traverse. The medics are with him now. I want you to call the number I'm about to give you. It's the hospital at Strahan. They've got him there. They'll be able to tell you more than I can." "Tell me more than you can about what, Yvonne? Just tell me what's." There was a pause, the kind of pause that later, in the retelling, in the newspaper interviews and the courtroom and the long nights she and her husband spent turning the day over and over like a stone that would not give up its secret, Diane would identify as the moment the old shape of her life ended and a new one, smaller and harder, began. "He collapsed on the track," Yvonne said. "They're doing everything they can." Diane heard herself ask whether Cal was conscious, and Yvonne did not answer that question at all, only repeated the phone number for Strahan twice, slowly, as though Diane were the one who might not be thinking clearly. Paul was at work, 40 minutes away, and it took her 3 tries to reach him. He told her to stay where she was, that he was coming home first, that they would ring Strahan together. She did not stay where she was. She rang Strahan on her own, and a nurse told her only that her son had been brought in critical and that a doctor would call back as soon as there was anything to say. There never was a call back from that doctor. By the time anyone rang the house again, it was Yvonne a second time, her voice gone somewhere flatter and further away, and this time she did not ask Diane to sit down. She simply said she was so very sorry, and Diane, who had not sat down the first time, sat down now on the kitchen floor, in the puddle of dishwater she had left there an hour before. 6 weeks earlier, Callum Renwick had been an ordinary 15-year-old boy asleep in his childhood bedroom, under a doona printed with a cricket motif he was slightly too old for and refused to give up, when 2 men he had never seen before walked through his door at 5:40 in the morning and told him to get dressed. To understand how her son came to be lying on a wilderness track 400 kilometers from home, dying in the care of strangers his parents had paid to take him, Diane would have to go back further than that morning. She would have to go back to the year Cal turned 14, when his older sister Mara, 19 and newly moved out, was pulled over on the southern outlet with a stranger's pills rattling loose in her handbag, and the family's attention, which had always seemed to Cal to flow toward his sister as a matter of course, narrowed on Mara entirely for the better part of a year, solicitor's appointments after school that ran long. Hush phone calls Diane took in the laundry with the door shut, Paul driving to Mara's share house at midnight more than once. Cal had been a watchful, tender kid before that, the sort of boy who gave his lunch away twice a week to a kid at Tarona District named Dylan who never seemed to bring one, who wrote long, strange, funny poems in the back of his exercise books, who cried at nature documentaries and pretended he hadn't, blaming hay fever or a trick of the light. One poem, found later folded into the spine of a school folder, began, "The tide doesn't care whose turn it is, it just comes in," and Diane has never been able to decide whether that line was about his sister or about himself. He didn't begrudge his sister the attention exactly. He told his mother once, stiffly, that he understood Mara needed help, and he wasn't a baby about it. But something in him went quiet after that, and then, over the following year, loud in the wrong ways. He started wagging school with an older crowd from Kingston and came home one Friday with a graze down one side of his face that he wouldn't explain, then admitted, badly, over a fortnight of pressing, that he had been jumped in a car park by 3 boys who called him a name that suggested. Paul Renwick would say this word, suggested, for years afterward, turning it like a screw that never quite tightened. That suggested Cal had been mixed up in something none of them understood. There was pot. There was one instance of Paul's boat trailer keys going missing and the family Hilux turning up 2 streets away with a crumpled guardrail and no explanation, Cal white and silent at the kitchen table while his father shouted himself hoarse. There was, worst of all to Diane, the silence. Her son, who used to tell her everything, who used to sit on the kitchen bench swinging his legs and narrating his entire day, had become someone who answered in single syllables and shut his door. They had already been seeing a family counselor once a fortnight, a soft-spoken woman named Elaine Voigt, who talked a great deal about boundaries and very little about solutions. In one of the last sessions before Stormbird, Elaine asked Cal directly what he wanted, and he said, after a long silence, "I want everyone to stop looking at me like I'm about to explode." Cal said nothing further, which both of his parents would later understand, far too late, as its own kind of answer. It was around this time that Diane's friend Lorna Vickers mentioned, over coffee at Salamanca, that her sister's boy had been a nightmare, honestly unlivewithable, and had gone away for 2 months to a wilderness program down in the Southwest and come back, in Lorna's words, a different kid. Softer. Grateful. The program was called Stormbird Crossing. It operated out of a staging depot near a settlement the locals called Quill's Crossing, a scatter of demountables, and a horse yard on the edge of the button-grass plains that ran west toward Frenchman's Cap, and it promised, in a glossy trifold brochure that arrived within the week, to return troubled teenagers to their families, recentred, humbled, and whole. The brochure showed a boy silhouetted against a sunset ridge line, pack on his back, arms raised in what was meant to read as triumph, and Diane would later admit she looked at that photograph more times than she read any of the accompanying text. Diane rang the number on the brochure on a Tuesday, and by the following Monday she and Paul were sitting in the lounge of a hotel on Elizabeth Street across a low table from Grant Corso and his wife. Grant was a compact, sun-cured man in his 40s with the bearing of someone who had spent a long time being obeyed. He told them within the first 5 minutes, served with the Army Reserve and then worked for years in the industry, a phrase he did not elaborate on. Yvonne did most of the talking about logistics, the 6-week program, the daily hikes, the campfire discussions where the kids opened up about the stuff that's really going on for them, while Grant watched Diane with an attentiveness that she found, at the time, reassuring, and that she would later understand had simply been the practiced attention of a salesman reading a mark. "What happens," Diane asked, "if Cal tells one of your counselors something's wrong? If he says he's sick, or, I don't know, hurt, or something's happened to him out there? What's the process?" "We take every report seriously," Grant said. "Every single one. But I'll tell you something, Diane, because I think you deserve to hear it straight. These kids lie. Not because they're bad kids. Because they've learned that lying works, that if they cry hard enough or say they're sick enough times, someone caves and they get to go home to the same bedroom, the same mates, the same mess. My job's to see through that. They test me for about 4 days and then they stop because they work out I'm not going anywhere and I'm not falling for it." He smiled, and it was, Diane thought, not an unkind smile. "Cal's not going to be able to talk his way around me. That's rather the point." Paul, who had been quiet, said that Cal did not respond well to being pushed, that the more you leaned on him, the more he dug in. Grant nodded as though he had heard this 1,000 times, which he had. "It's not about breaking anyone down for the sake of it," he said. "It's about getting past the performance to the kid underneath. I promise you, Paul, by the time he comes home, he'll be thanking you for this." He reached across the table and put his hand briefly over Diane's, and told her he had a daughter of his own, and understood how frightening it was to watch a child you loved slipping out of reach. Diane would remember that gesture for the rest of her life. That night, back in Sandy Bay, Paul and Diane sat up at the kitchen table with the brochure between them. "It feels extreme," Paul said. Two men walking into his room before dawn. "That's extreme, D." Diane said only, "I don't know what else we have left to try." Somewhere around midnight, they signed the intake forms under the light above the stove, the same light Diane had stood beneath with her hands in dishwater on the day the phone rang 6 weeks later. The program cost $14,500 plus transport, and for an additional $600 Grant would fly to Hobart himself and escort Cal down to the depot, which he said was always easier than a tearful scene in a driveway. Paul and Diane refinanced part of the house to cover it. 2 days later, at 10 to 6 on a Thursday morning, Grant Corso and a younger man Diane had never met came into their son's bedroom, and Cal woke to find his father standing at the foot of his bed with 2 strangers behind him.
"Dad."
"I love you, mate," Paul said, and his voice cracked in a way he had rehearsed, not letting it crack. "But we can't keep going the way we've been going. These fellas are going to take you somewhere for a while." Cal was out of the doona and halfway to standing before the younger man. A broad-shouldered 20-something named Reed crossed the room and put a hand flat on his chest, pushing him back down onto the mattress with an ease that made the size difference between them entirely clear. "Easy," Reed said. "We're not here to hurt you. But if you make this hard, I'll make it harder. Your call." Mara, home for the weekend, was woken by the noise and came to stand in the hallway, arms wrapped around herself, watching her little brother being walked past her in yesterday's clothes. She would tell Diane, years later, that she had almost asked what the hell was going on, and had not, because some old family instinct told her this was not, this time about her. She has never forgiven herself for staying out of it. Diane tried to hug her son as he was walked past her toward the front door, no shoes, a jacket someone had thrown over his shoulders. Grant's hand came up between them, not touching her, simply present, a small closed door. "Better if we keep momentum," he said. Diane managed to press her mouth to Cal's cheek and say, "I love you, we'll talk soon," and her son, white-faced, did not say anything back. Paul stood in the driveway and watched the car go, and then went inside and was sick in the laundry sink, and neither he nor Mara said anything to each other about it. Not that morning, not for years. For the first 10 days, Diane was told, Cal was in an intake phase they called settling, camped with 5 other new arrivals on an exposed rise above the button grass where the wind came off the Arthurs with nothing to slow it down. He was issued 2 changes of clothes, a sleeping bag rated for conditions milder than the ones he was about to face, and boots a size and a half too small. He was given a hardback notebook and told that everything in it, his private reflections, letters he might write home, would be read by staff before it went anywhere. In the essay he was made to write about why he'd been sent, Cal wrote, "I don't think this is going to fix anything. I think it's going to make me hate something that used to just be normal life. If this is love, I don't understand it yet, but I'm going to try to understand it because I don't want to lose my family over being angry." He tried, in his own way, to make peace with it. On his 4th day, he apologized to Yvonne for having been sullen when they first met, and Yvonne, who had heard 1,000 such apologies and disbelieved everyone, told him flatly that she wasn't interested in being managed. He couldn't get a coal bed fire going with the hand drill method the counselors taught, the weight of his numb hands defeating the friction every time, and because the rule was that a boy who couldn't light his own fire didn't get to sit at anyone else's, he went to bed cold and hungry more nights than not during that first phase, before the real walking had even begun. One of the other boys at settling, a quiet 14-year-old from Launceston named Ben Draycott, showed him on the 9th night how to angle the drill so the friction caught, and said nothing when the small flame finally took, only nodded once, as if that were the whole of the kindness he was permitted to offer. Cal wrote of him that night, "There's a kid here called Ben who helped me get a fire going without making me feel like an idiot about it. First time anyone's done anything like that since I got here." The real walking began in the second phase, which staff called the Traverse. 6 weeks of hiking, with a rotating cast of counselors, 19-year-old Shane Osler, 20-year-old Reed Kowalski, and 21-year-old Trent Sabo, 2 of them with a group of 6 boys at any time while the third rested at the depot. It opened with a fast, food withheld for the first 2 days while they hiked into increasingly remote country, sharp quartzite underfoot. The track sometimes nothing more than a suggestion between pandanny and cutting grass. Cal's boots raised blisters within a day. His pack, at 19 kilos, kept dragging him backward on the scree. He began to fall, first once, catching himself, and then again and again as the days accumulated. Ben Draycott walked near him where he could, and once passed him half a muesli bar palmed from his own ration, an act of quiet defiance that Cal never forgot. He told them anyway, eventually in the flat, exhausted language of his journal. "My stomach's been bad since day 3, and it's not getting better, it's getting like a fist that squeezes. I told Trent, and he said everyone's stomach hurts out here. That's the program working. I don't think this is the program working. I think something is actually wrong with me, and nobody believes me because I already used up my believing on being annoying at settling." The counselors had been trained. In the manual, every one of them signed on being hired, in language about dignity and adequate food and shelter and medical care, a page Cal never saw that explicitly forbade the withholding of meals, the denial of bedding, the use of ridicule as a management tool. In practice, on the Traverse, the culture ran in the opposite direction. When Cal fell a second time and could not immediately rise under the weight of his pack, Shane Osler stood over him and said, "Get up. Nobody's carrying you." When his nose began bleeding after a fall against a rock face on the 8th day, splashing dark spots across the pages of his journal that are still visible in the surviving copy, Trent Sabo told the group that Cal was auditioning for sympathy and made the other 5 boys watch while Cal, one-handed, fumbled his tent poles back into their sleeve with blood still running down his chin. Within a fortnight, the other boys, taking their cue from the men meant to be caring for all of them, had started calling him a girl's name as an insult whenever he stumbled, and it hurt him more than the falling did. Ben Draycott did not join in, and was mocked for it in turn, until even he began to fall quiet around the fire rather than defend a friend he was increasingly afraid to be seen defending. There were smaller cruelties, cumulative and almost bureaucratic in their pettiness. His sleeping bag confiscated for 2 nights after he was slow breaking camp, so that he slept in a canvas bivvy sheet with the cold coming up through the ground like something alive. Food withheld across 4 separate days as punishment for infractions that would have seemed trivial in any other setting. Failing to scrub a billy properly, losing a glove, crying during a group check-in in a way Reed Kowalski decided was manipulative. He ate what he could find and was not supposed to. A lizard once, cooked badly over a fire he'd finally managed to coax alight, a native currant bush stripped bare. The soft inner bark of a tree Ben showed him was edible if you were desperate enough. He wrote, "Today I ate ants off a log because I was so hungry, I stopped caring how it looked. I keep thinking about Mum's lentil soup, which is so stupid because I used to complain about that soup. I would eat 4 bowls of it right now and say thank you every single time." On another page he had written and crossed out, then rewritten more faintly beneath the crossing out, "I don't think I'm going to make it the whole 6 weeks feeling like this." By the 3rd week his body had begun to fail in ways that were no longer deniable even by the standards of a program built on disbelieving its charges. He lost control of his bladder one night, and humiliated, tried to hide the wet sleeping bag. When it was discovered, he was mocked in front of the group by Shane Osler, who held it up and asked if anyone else needed nappies. 2 days later, setting off on the morning walk, he soiled himself without warning, and this too became an occasion for laughter around the breakfast fire, a story the counselors would later, incredibly, repeat to his mother on the phone as evidence of Cal's manipulative streak. "My hands don't feel like my hands anymore," he wrote, the entry dated 11 days before he died. "I keep asking to see a doctor, and Trent says the nearest doctor is a helicopter ride away, and I'm not sick enough for a helicopter." I believe him more than I believe myself at this point. "I'm scared, but I don't want anyone here to see that because they'll say I'm faking that too." On her Tuesday evening calls to the Stormbird office, conducted on a satellite line that dropped out if the wind was up, Diane was told, week after week, that Cal was still finding his feet, that he'd been caught trying to take food from another boy's ration bag, an accusation, it would later emerge, invented wholesale by a counselor to explain his hunger without implicating the punishment regime that had caused it. That his attitude problems meant he was unlikely to graduate on schedule. "He's a good kid underneath it, Diane," Yvonne told her once, "but he's testing every boundary we put up, and honestly, that tells me the work's landing." Diane once asked, baffled, why Cal had apparently soiled himself on a hike, and was told cheerfully by Yvonne that this was a manipulation tactic some kids used to force a break in the walking, that it meant nothing, that she shouldn't worry. "Kids do all sorts of things for attention out here," Yvonne said, and Diane wrote the phrase down on the notepad by the kitchen phone and still cannot say, 20 years later, whether she underlined it because she believed it or because some part of her already didn't. She asked once whether she could speak to Cal directly. Yvonne told her that phone contact during the Traverse phase would undermine the program's structure, and that hearing his mother's voice would only make the homesickness worse for him, not better. Diane put the phone down each week feeling something was wrong that she could not name and did not have the vocabulary or the permission to push past. The last entry in Callum Renwick's journal is dated the night before the morning he could no longer stand. It reads, in its entirety, "Cold again tonight, no bag, I can't feel my feet. I keep thinking about the drive to the airport and how I didn't hug Mom properly because I was angry and trying to look tough in front of Dad and the two men. I wish I'd hugged her. I wish I'd told both of them I love them instead of nothing. If I get through this, I'm going to tell them, every day, I love you, Mom. I love you, Dad. I love you, Mara, even though you probably don't know I mean it." He did not get through it. Over the following 4 days, he was unable to keep pace with the group, hiking at times less than 2 kilometers before collapsing. The emergency medic attached to the program, Georgina Price, was called out once, found him flushed and dry-skinned, his abdomen rigid to the touch in a way she would later concede, under oath, should have alarmed her far more than it did, and, not told by the counselors how long he'd gone without food or shelter, left him a piece of cheese, told him to keep walking, and did not return for 2 more days. Ben Draycott sat with him that last night, and Cal told him, in a voice gone thin and strange, that he thought something inside him had gone wrong, like actually wrong, not made up wrong, and asked Ben to tell his mom he was sorry if anything happened. Ben, 14 and frightened, told him to stop talking like that he'd be fine. Neither of them slept much. On the morning he died, it took Cal the better part of an hour to crawl the short distance from where he'd slept to the cold fire, falling asleep partway there more than once from sheer exhaustion, the other boys watching in a silence none of them could later explain except to say they had learned, by then, that saying anything only made things worse for whoever said it. When he said he needed the latrine, 2 counselors half-carried him to it and left him alone, and it was there that a young Aboriginal trainee guide named Jera Mansell, sent over from a neighboring group to collect him for the medic's visit, found him, fallen, unable to lift himself, covered in his own filth, alone in the Tasmanian bush a full day's walk from the nearest road. Jera, 22 and only 8 months into the job, lifted him out with 2 of his own campers helping and carried him to shade. "Are you trying to die, mate?" he asked, gently, crouching in front of him, because it was the only way he knew to ask the real question. "No," Cal said. His voice barely carried. "I don't want to die. I want to go home." Jera made him a cup of black tea with sugar stirred in, and Cal managed 3 sips before he couldn't manage any more. He told Jera he could see white light at the edges of everything. Jera, who had grown up on his grandmother's stories of country and knew, without any medical training at all, simply from the stillness that had come into the boy's face, that something in him was closing down, broke off a handful of gum leaves and crushed them in his palm, and sat with Cal in the shade until a vehicle could come, holding the boy's hand, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say that would help. The Uda arrived not long after, driven by Denny Doyle, son of Stormbird's co-owner Warwick Doyle. "Get the faker sat up," Denny said to Jera as he pulled in, and Jera, who had by then understood exactly how wrong that word was, did not answer him, only lifted Cal himself, taking the weight of him like something precious rather than something to be hauled. They lifted Cal into the back seat because he could not climb in himself. 15 minutes later, while Denny stood talking with another staff member outside the vehicle, there was a soft, repeated knocking from inside the cabin, Cal's head falling against the window as his body seized, and then went still. There was no pulse when they pulled him out onto the ground. Jera began compressions while Denny radioed for help, his voice climbing out of its practiced calm for the first time all week. Georgina Price arrived within minutes and worked on him with a paramedic who had flown in from Strahan, both of them refusing to stop long after any reasonable hope had passed, until a helicopter came in low over the plains and took what was left of Callum Renwick to a hospital that could do nothing more for him than confirm what the bush already knew. Diane and Paul drove north from Strahan to Hobart 4 days later behind their son's coffin, having identified his body in a room that neither of them, 20 years on, can describe without stopping to breathe. The boy on the table had lost nearly a quarter of his body weight in 6 weeks. His arms and legs were a mess of bruising, old and new, and there was a pattern of open, weeping sores from his waist down that the coroner would later attribute to the incontinence he had suffered, untreated, for the better part of 2 weeks. They knew him only by a small crescent scar above his eyebrow, souvenir of a bicycle accident when he was 7. Mara stood in the corridor outside that room and would not go in, and nobody made her, and she has told Diane since that not going in is one of the decisions of her life she would take back if she could. The post-mortem found the cause of death to be peritonitis, a massive abdominal infection, traced to a ruptured appendix that had almost certainly begun to fail him in the first fortnight of the traverse, precisely the period in which he had first complained, in writing and aloud, of a stomach ache that would not ease. Any competent examination in the first week would likely have caught it. Antibiotics, even administered as late as the morning of his final collapse, would in all likelihood have saved him. The forensic pathologist who gave evidence at committal put it in terms Diane has never forgotten, that her son's body had been trying, for the better part of a month, to tell everyone around him exactly what was wrong, in the only language it had left. A week after the funeral, a reporter named Ruth Callahan, who covered state and legal affairs for the Derwent Chronicle, rang the Renwick house asking whether Diane knew that Stormbird Crossings founder, Grant Corso, had once been criminally charged over the death of another teenager, years earlier, at a different wilderness operator entirely. Diane, who had buried her son 6 days before, sat on the same kitchen floor she had sat on the day of the phone call and listened to a stranger tell her the true shape of the thing she had signed her son's life over to. The story Ruth laid out for them, and later for her readers, went back 6 years to a company called Rimrock Expeditions, run by a magnetic, self-mythologizing former outdoor educator named Selwyn Draper. Rimrock had, in its second year, employed a young admissions coordinator named Nolene Vance, who left to start her own rival program, Southlight Wilderness, taking Rimrock's glowing parent testimonials with her to use as her own. In Southlight's very first intake, a 15-year-old girl named Priya Osei died of dehydration and heat stroke on a misdirected hike after counselors, lost and low on water, refused to share their own rations with her, dismissing her collapse as attention-seeking until it was far too late. 6 weeks later, a 16-year-old boy named Tyler Voss collapsed and died on a Rimrock hike under nearly identical circumstances. This time the state laid charges. Selwyn Draper and one of his senior guides, a hard, sun-weathered young man named Grant Corso, were charged with negligent homicide and child endangerment. The first trial ended in a mistrial. The second, after former Rimrock staff testified to routine abuse, ended in acquittal. The jury, unconvinced the prosecution, had proven intent beyond doubt. Grant Corso had told a colleague, not long before all this became public, that some losses were simply the cost of helping enough kids. A window of loss, he'd called it, and said it was worth it. Within months of his acquittal, Corso and a business partner named Warwick Doyle were granted a license to open Stormbird Crossing. Diane and Paul had never been told any of it. Nobody who sold them the brochure, the reference list, the reassurances in the hotel lounge on Elizabeth Street had mentioned that the man flying up to collect their son from his bed had once stood trial for exactly this. Ruth Callahan would later establish that the relevant state authority had received Corso's application, noted his prior acquittal, and approved it anyway on the basis that an acquittal was, in the words of the file note, not evidence of wrongdoing. Detective Senior Constable Ellen Trask, assigned to investigate Cal's death, did not initially believe she was looking at a homicide. Staff accounts were consistent, calm, and unanimous. A sudden, unforeseeable collapse, tragic and unpreventable. She found Grant Corso composed, sympathetic, generous with his time, a man who used words like devastated and heartbroken with what seemed, on a first hearing, like real feeling behind them. But this was the third such death connected to this small cluster of operators in 6 years, and Trask knew enough not to take consistency at face value, especially consistency that arrived this smoothly, this early. She seized the campers' journals, including Cal's, along with weather logs and ration records, and began the slow work of cross-referencing what the counselors had told parents against what 14 teenagers, independently, had written in their own private pages while it was happening to them. A photograph of Cal, gap-toothed, laughing at something off-camera, pinned above her desk, because she said afterward she needed to look at his face while she read what had been done to him, or she was afraid she would start reading it as a case file instead of a boy. The accounts matched, boy for boy, page for page. 14 nights Cal had gone without a sleeping bag, for of those without so much as a blanket, 11 days on which he had been given no food at all. Other campers described trying, in secret, to slip him mouthfuls of their own rations and being too frightened of the consequences to do it often. Ben Draycott's journal was the one that made her put down her pen for the night. I should have said something to a grown-up instead of just to him. In September, 6 months after Cal's death, Trask led a surprise inspection of the Stormbird depot with a doctor, a nurse, and a psychologist in tow, arriving before dawn on a logging road so the vehicles would not be heard approaching. Of the 17 teenagers still enrolled, 3 girls were assessed as too unwell to continue and removed on the spot. When Ruth Callahan rang Grant Corso for comment, he told her the inspection was a beat-up, a witch hunt dressed up as child protection, and insisted that nobody at Stormbird could possibly have known how sick Cal was. Warwick Doyle, for his part, suggested to Ruth that Cal's prior marijuana use had likely masked his own pain from himself for weeks, a theory the coroner's office dismissed within a single phone call as medically baseless. 6 weeks after the inspection, prosecutors filed charges against Corso, Doyle, and 5 staff, including the 3 counselors and Georgina Price, the medic. Price faced an additional charge of attempting to influence witnesses, later dropped for insufficient evidence. A more serious blow to the prosecution's case came when Jera Mansell, the one staff member willing to testify fully about what he'd seen, was found to have separately admitted his own past misconduct at an earlier posting, undermining his usefulness as a witness in the eyes of the Crown. Even as the Renwicks never stopped believing that the boy who sat with their son in his final hour deserved better than to be discarded by the process. Diane wrote to Jera once, simply to say thank you for the tea and the gum leaves and for staying, and never learned whether the letter reached him. 2 of Cal's fellow campers testified anyway at a committal hearing that ran for 11 days. Ben Draycott, 16 by then, stood in the witness box and described the muesli bar, the fire on the 9th night, the way the group learned to go quiet rather than defend anyone, his voice steady until defense counsel asked him, gently, whether he could be certain Cal hadn't exaggerated his symptoms for sympathy, and Ben said, I watched him not be able to stand up. You can't fake that for 6 weeks. He did it for a month because it wasn't fake. A second boy gave evidence about the confiscated sleeping bags and the mocking around the fire, and broke down partway through his testimony, and the magistrate told him, not unkindly, that there was no clock running on grief in that courtroom. Crown Prosecutor Owen Falk, in his closing address, said simply, once the word went round that this boy was a faker, that was the operating theory at Stormbird Crossing from the top down. Nobody wants to say it plainly, so I will. You do not fake losing a quarter of your own body weight in 6 weeks. Nobody has ever managed that trick. He held up, as he said it, a photocopy of the journal page dated 11 days before Cal's death, the one about the fist that squeezed, about not being sick enough for a helicopter, and read it into the record slowly, letting the boy's own handwriting, magnified on a screen behind him, do work that no closing argument could have done as well. All 7 defendants were sent to trial. In the months that followed, 6 accepted negotiated pleas, Grant Corso and Warwick Doyle pleading guilty to negligent management of a licensed program and reckless endangerment, along with 2 of the 3 counselors and Georgina Price, each receiving suspended custodial sentences, probation, fines, and mandated community service. A 7th, more junior staff member accepted a diversion agreement in exchange for a clean record. Diane sat through the sentencing of all 6, dry-eyed in a way that frightened her more than crying would have, and told Paul afterward that she had wanted to feel something like satisfaction and had instead felt only the same flat, gray nothing she had felt looking at the crescent scar on the table at the morgue. Trent Sabo alone refused to deal. 21 at the time of Cal's death, he had shown a hard, unrepentant face throughout the committal hearing. Diane would later describe catching him smirking at her from the dock, and once, when he thought the magistrate wasn't looking, giving her the finger. He went to trial alone on a charge of criminal neglect of a vulnerable minor. His barrister argued he had simply been following an established chain of command and bore no more responsibility than any junior staff member obeying orders from above. The Crown called Ben Draycott a second time to describe the tentpole incident directly to Sabo's face, and Ben asked whether the defendant had ever shown him or Cal any kindness at all in 6 weeks, thought about it for a long moment in the box and said, "Not that I can remember. Not once." The jury did not accept the chain of command defense and returned a guilty verdict within a single afternoon. After the verdict, Sabo approached Diane in the courthouse corridor and, to her lasting confusion, embraced her, telling her he hadn't known how sick Cal really was. She hugged him back anyway, because some instinct in her still wanted to believe people could change. His defense tried to use that same embrace as evidence of remorse at sentencing, a maneuver that left Diane so angry she rewrote her victim impact statement the night before to include, in full, the detail of the finger in the dock, ending with the line, "You don't get to keep the hug and the finger both. I gave you the hug because I am still, after everything, a person who hopes. That is mine to give. It was never yours to use." Sabo was sentenced to 12 months, served 4, and was released. The Renwicks pursued and settled a civil claim against Stormbird's insurers and became, in the years that followed, reluctant but persistent public advocates against the wilderness therapy industry, appearing on current affairs programs and giving evidence to a state parliamentary inquiry that Ruth Callahan's reporting had helped force into being. "These programs sell tough love," Paul told one interviewer, "but you can only do the love part if you actually love the child in front of you. These people had never met our son before the morning they carried him out of his bed." They were not universally welcomed as advocates. One mother told Diane bluntly at a public forum that she should have known what she was signing her son up for. "We wanted a firm hand," the woman said. "You get what you pay for." Diane, recounting the exchange later, said only that people like Stormbird sold you exactly what you were looking for, and that was the whole design of the thing. Mara, who had never spoken publicly about her brother, surprised her parents by writing a short piece for a youth mental health newsletter under her own name, describing the year her own troubles had swallowed the family's attention, and the brother who never once made her feel like the reason for it. The parliamentary inquiry led, 18 months later, to the state's first licensing framework covering youth wilderness and behavior modification programs, mandating independent medical assessment before and during any hike, minimum food and shelter standards enforceable by unannounced inspection, and a public register of past findings against any operator, a register that, had it existed 3 years earlier, would have carried Grant Corso's name in the very first entry. Diane gave evidence to that inquiry herself, and when a committee member asked her what she would say to a parent considering a program like Stormbird today, she said, "Ask them what happens the day your child tells them the truth and they don't believe it. If they can't answer that clearly, take your son or your daughter home." Years afterward, a documentary crew making a film about the wilderness therapy movement tracked Corso down to a small property outside Deloraine, where he now bred working dogs. Older, heavier, his voice roughened by decades of cigarettes, he told the camera he stood by everything he'd built. "We didn't break kids down to hurt them," he said. "We broke them down so we could build something steadier back up. Some of them were properly scared out there, and that never much bothered me. A bit of fear does a kid good." Asked about the phrase "a window of loss," he did not deny having said it, only shrugged. Diane, asked for a response, said only, "You can do tough love if it's love holding the tough up." He never had the second half. He only ever had the first. What the Renwicks kept, in the end, once the trial and the inquiry and the documentary cameras had all moved on, was the small hardback notebook the police returned to them after their case files closed. Diane has read it end to end perhaps a dozen times, always alone, always at night. The entry she returns to most is not the last one, though she has that one nearly memorized too, but an earlier page, written in the first week, before the worst of it, in handwriting that was still steady. "I keep thinking about the morning they took me and how I didn't hug Mum back properly. I was trying to look like it didn't matter to me. I wish I could go back and just hug her and tell her I love her and not care how it looks. I'll do it the second I'm home. First thing, before anything else." He never got to do it the second he was home. So Diane does it instead, some nights, standing alone in the kitchen at Sandy Bay with the light off, arms wrapped around herself in the exact place in the hallway where she last held him, Not because it fixes anything, she says, but because someone in the family owes him that hug back, and it might as well be her. This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. That was Nobody Carries You, an Emovura Audiobooks original. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.